Okay, Parsha in a nutshell. Here we go. Okay, here we go. The Parsha of Tazria continues the discussion of the laws of Tuma V'Tahara, which was purity and ritual impurity. Ritual impurity and purity. So we begin with something that is strange that the Torah would say is impure, but that's nevertheless the case. Maybe we'll discuss it if we have time. A woman giving birth should undergo a process of purification, which includes immersing in a mikvah, a naturally gathered pool of water, and bringing offerings to the holy temple. And the Torah gives us the exact details of the purity, of the ritual impurity of a woman giving birth, depending on if she gives birth to a male or a female. But that is, that we'll get to maybe. Okay, all male infants are to be circumcised on the 8th day of life. Tzarat, often mistranslated as leprosy, in other words, they're saying it's not leprosy, is a supernatural plague which can afflict people as well as garments or homes. If white or pink patches appear on a person's skin, or if you get dark red or green in garments, a Kohen, the priest, is summoned, judging by various signs, such as an increase in size of the affected area. After a 7-day quarantine, the Kohen pronounces it tameh, impure, or tahor, pure. And this is just one paragraph, but in the Torah you have many, many verses at great length, giving all the signs of purity and impurity. And there's in between stages. Sometimes the person, we're not sure, so they quarantine the person for a week, and then we look at it again. And if we're not sure, we have another week. There's two-week quarantine, and then after the second week, then the Kohen pronounces pure or impure. Many, many details. A person afflicted with tzarat must dwell alone outside the camp or city until he is healed. The affected area in a garment or home must be removed. If the tzarat reoccurs, the entire garment or home must be destroyed. So this is, as we say, this is the story in a nutshell. So before we get into the details of discussing what the tzarat is, what it represents, or what the impurity of women giving birth, and next week we find other forms of impurity of different bodily discharges, semen or blood, we want to give a little introduction about what is this business of purity and impurity, and more importantly, what is it doing here exactly in the middle of the 3rd book of the Torah? So what's happening here is, one way to look at it, the superficial way to look at it is that the 3rd book of the Torah, there's not that many stories. So we pack in all the ritual. So the offerings is ritual. The laws of purity and impurity are ritual. And therefore, there's no question. Why does the book of the 3rd book, the book of Leviticus, the book that describes the laws of the offerings, or the way that traditional name for the book is Torat Kohanim, the Torah of the priests. So it's not surprising that you have the laws of purity and impurity, because you have to be pure to come to the temple. Okay, fine. That's one way to look at it. But if you want to look at it from a deeper level, it's actually pretty surprising, because what you have in this 3rd book is, in some sense, it's the holiest book, because it's the book that tells us how to come close to God with the offerings. Later on in the book tells us holidays, sabbatical year in Israel is all in the 3rd book, which happens to be right now, this is a sabbatical year. And Yom Kippur is in this book. You have the inauguration of a temple, when God dwells in the temple, is in the 3rd book, as we discussed at length last week and the week before. So you're dealing with a book that is, I would say, in some sense, the most intensely holy book in the Torah. Yet, together with that, you have the other extreme. All forms of impurity end up in this book, right? So we talk about women giving birth, we talk about the bodily discharges, we talk about tzarat, leprosy, and it's not just a little bit, it's not just a few details. There are 2 full portions about this about this form of leprosy. I don't want to call it leprosy, just for convenience, I call it leprosy. So you have so much space in this book talking about the laws of purity and impurity. Last week, we talked about kosher animals, I mean, my God, we're coming to the temple and you're coming close to God. And for an 8th day, the divine presence dwells in the Jewish people. The next thing, okay, don't eat this animal, don't eat that animal. It feels like we're jumping from intense holiness to a space of impurity, which represents some form of negativity and unholiness. So just to think about this for a little bit, I think is like this. The story of the human being. This is the story of the human being. The story of the human being is that the human being is comprised of physical, spiritual, body, and soul. In other words, this contrast between intense holiness and impurity is not surprising that when you talk about intense holiness, you're also talking about laws of purity and impurity, because that is really the story of man. The human being, has a soul, which is part of God, intensely holy, but the human being also has the physical existence, animal soul, evil inclination, and these two live together. And so one way to frame the entire third book, one way to frame of this is the third book is really a way to figure out how do you balance between these two extremes that people have within themselves, the soul, which wants to lead you to intense holiness, whereas the body, which would lead you, if you follow it and unguided, could lead you to places of negativity and unholiness. So we have this built-in tension in our life based on our own makeup. And therefore, it's no surprise that the third book is dancing and jumping between these two extremes, because that's the way it is within the human being. That's how the human being feels. One moment I feel intensely holy, the next moment I feel impure. That's the story of man. And therefore, that's reflected in the third book as well. Right? So just going off topic a minute, if you look at the name for the human being, Adam. Adam is the name of Adam, the first human being, but Adam is also the general name for humanity. Bnei Adam, sons of man. So when God creates the first man, the prototype, so to speak, why does God call him Adam, right? Hebrew language, everything has to have a meaning. It's not just conventional. We decide we're going to call this object by this name. No, there's meaning within every name and word. So the Torah itself tells you or alludes to why Adam was given this name. What does the Torah tell us? Or where does the Torah allude to this? Okay, you're going to be able to hear it. You're able to hear the ring. I'm looking at Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And Hashem, God, formed the man of dust from the ground. Okay? Adam is man. What is ground? Adama. Adam, Adama. The root of Adama is Adam. Same letters. What is man? Man is basically earth. Man is basically physical stuff. And there's no surprise, therefore, that a few minutes later, a few pages later, when God gives us one command not to eat of the tree of knowledge, we succumb. Because what are we? We're earth. On the other hand, the Kabbalists say that same word, Adam, which conventionally means Adama, earth, has another meaning as well. This the Kabbalists offered and revealed, so to speak. And they say that the word Adam can also comes from the word Adameh, I will be similar. And there's a verse in the Bible, I believe in Job, that says Adameh le'elyon, I will be similar to the one above, similar to God. In other words, what is man? Man is a reflection of God. Why? Because man was created in the image of God. So here you have one new creation with one name, Adam, and this name actually captures both extremes. Am I a lump of earth? This is Adam. God made me earth from the ground. Or am I a creation that is similar to the divine? Okay, that's the opposite extreme. Which one am I? I'm both. Why? Because that's the contradiction of man. Because man is really the coming together of two extremes of body and soul. Okay, fine. How do I deal with this tension? The fact that I have body and soul. So tension is not good. People don't like tension. And therefore, there's basically two ways to deal with this. There's a third way. The third way is always the hardest way. But it's not surprising. The first two ways, the easy way out is to pick a side, right? You don't want to live in tension your whole life unless you come to the Tanya class on Friday. And then you figure out how to manage the tension. That's just a plug. But you don't want to manage tension naturally. You don't want tension. We like comfort. We like to sit on the beach with our feet up. People don't like comfort. People don't like tension. So you pick a side. And therefore, the third book discusses also, you basically have people that take one extreme. Later on in the book, we talk about, God forbid, don't do like the abominations of Egypt or of the land of Canaan, who become corrupt. Why do they become corrupt? Because they say we are earth from the ground. We're physical. We're going to follow our physical instincts. What do you end up with? You end up with a corrupt society. Right? So you basically block out the divine voice, just follow your physical needs and physical instincts, and you end up with Egypt or Canaan, the two corrupt societies at the time the Torah was given. And the Torah has to go out of its way. On Yom Kippur, we read this. It's in a few portions from now. Kemasa Eretz Mitzrayim. Don't do like the actions of the land of Egypt, and don't, which you emerged from, and don't do like the actions of the land of Canaan, which you're going to. Right? Don't follow those. Because we understand there's a natural drive to follow. There's a natural inclination to pick a side. I have two opposite desires. Pick a side and stick with it. Okay, that's one side. I can follow my body, follow my instincts, follow my physicality. Then you have another idea. The other idea is that you start with you say, you know what? I don't like this tension. I want to be in touch completely with my spiritual side. And what do you end up with? Just spirituality, escaping the physical. We discussed this last week, I think. I'm sure we did. I don't remember. Not that my memory is that good. I don't remember what we discussed last week, but I'm sure we discussed it because it's so important a concept, right? The death of the sons of Aaron, which, what do they want? They want to run to the temple. They want to escape physical life. That's the way the Kabbalists explain that story. And they say, you know what? Because we're living in a world that is both a combination of physical and spiritual, if we try to balance between both, we live a tension that ultimately we cannot handle. So let's escape the physical. Let's devote ourselves completely to spiritual, ignore the physical, suppress the physical, and then we will end up sort of become angelic. And that's the sons of Aaron. What does the Torah tell us about that? So these are the two natural approaches because we have this tension. Now, what do we know? We know the reality is that the Torah wants us to embrace this tension. And the Torah believes in the model that the Kabbalists refer to as running and returning. Running and returning means, yes, in the beginning. In other words, first you have to have a desire to cleave to spirituality. Because if you don't, if I'm just a physical entity, the physicality will bring me down. Yet just to run and escape is not good. It doesn't say escape, it says run. Run means desire. But then you have to return. Return means take that energy, take that desire to cleave to God and return to the physical world with that enlightenment so that you could sanctify the physical world. That's the attitude that a person is supposed to live, to be able to dance through this tension. Don't be pulled on both sides, but you're dancing. When you're dancing, you're managing. You're managing the tension. You're being pulled. You're going. You're coming. There's movement. That's how the tension is released, so to speak. And therefore, when you start reading what the Torah says, what the Kabbalah says in the third book, you can't read a few pages without going back to this theme of running and returning, Ratzov Vashov, running and returning, and it keeps reoccurring. Why? Because this is the core. This is the core issue. This is the core issue that we're addressing. We are the third book. We are people who, on one hand, are able to feel great desire and great spirituality and closeness to God. On the other hand, almost simultaneously, we can feel weak, spiritually weak, morally weak, impure. Impure means, we'll talk about what impurity means, but one definition is we feel that we are controlled by nature, we succumb to nature, we don't have necessarily choice, we feel like we're trapped by our instincts, and we sort of are a little bit of both of these creations. And like I said, the tendency would be to pick a side. And most people do the easier side, which listens to the physical. The spiritual people will listen to the spiritual and just follow the spiritual. That neither path is right. You have to have the running and returning. And therefore, you would see this within the Kabbalistic interpretation of all of the third book. That's a recurring theme. Now, we can also talk about that this idea of running and returning is also in the tzarat, in the leprosy. We may or may not get there, depending on how much time we have. If we don't do it this week, we'll do it next week. But I'm just going to show this theme, the way the Rebbe taught it, within the first verse of this week's parsha. So what is this week's parsha? What's the first verse? Parsha text. Here we go. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives and gives birth to a male, she shall be unclean for 7 days. As in the days of her menstrual flow, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Okay, fine. So without going into all these details, even before we go into the details, let's look at the first verses, the first words. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives, Isha, a woman who will conceive and give birth to a male. Now, the word for Tazria, conceive, is a very unusual word. It's the name of this parsha, Tazria. Tazria comes from the word zera, which is seed. So it's almost, if you want to read it literally, a woman who will plant a seed and give birth to a male. Okay. So you want to read this Kabbalistically, like the Rebbe did. Let's look at the word woman. What is woman? So woman, we know the moment you say woman, we're talking also, in addition to the simple meaning, we're talking about the relationship between God and the Jewish people, which is likened to man and woman. And woman, again, going back to Genesis, when God creates Eve, he says, I'm going to name her Isha. Why Isha? Ki me'ish lukachazot. She was taken from man, right? According to the biblical story, God puts Adam to sleep and takes what? To build a woman. You may have heard he take a rib. It's not what the word means. It means took a side. It's another story. The bottom line is woman comes from man. That's the story. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean biologically. That's a different discussion. But spiritually, it does mean woman was taken from man. Because who's woman? The Jewish people, the soul. Who are we taken from? Man. Who's man? Man is a metaphor for God. God is the giver, we're the recipient. In that relationship, male, female, is God and the Jewish people. So Isha is the woman, Isha is the Jewish people, when they sense that they're Isha, when they sense that they're part of God, that they were taken from God, right? So Isha is when you feel the romance, when you feel the love, when your soul feels the closeness to God. And what do you want to do? You want to go upward, right? We know the metaphor of the soul is like the candle. I think we discussed this many times. The candle seeks to escape. What does the Torah continue? Isha ki tazria, you have to plant. What is plant? Plant is you have to come down to earth. To plant, you have to touch the soil. You have to go into the soil, not just on the surface of the soil. You have to dig, turn the ground over, right? So you really have to get your feet dirty. No, is it dirty? You have to get your feet within the soil. And then what happens when you get into the soil, actually you can grow things. New things could emerge, things that could not have emerged if you had stayed on the top of the skyscraper and not gone down to the level of the soil. So mystically speaking, what we're saying here is that you have to be a Isha, you have to be a woman. You have to have a desire, you have to sense that you're part of God. And that naturally would want to pull you up. But the lesson is Tazria, you have to bring yourself down. And you have to plant within this physical world, because maybe that's not where you want to be, but that's what God wants of you. And then when you do that, it will give birth to holiness and blessing and ultimately transformation, transforming the world to a place of serenity and holiness. So that's just a little bit about the place of purity and impurity in the third book, and why the third book is full of it, even though we're talking about holiness and unholiness. Yes, it's not a contradiction. We are both holy and impure. They both live side by side. Our job is to manage the tension between the two. So that is all by way of introduction. Now we can start the parsha. So if anybody has any questions on something specific or what you want to address or what piqued your interests, please share. Otherwise, we'll do what we usually do, which is start from the beginning. Okay, one more point about this theme. One more point about this theme, highlighting the idea that man really captures both extremes. So to get to this idea, I'm just going to open Rashi, because Rashi has the commentary from the Talmud, and then this Hasidic commentary on Rashi's commentary. So we have layers So that's good. But in the meantime, Richard, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. One quick question. There was one point, I don't know if it was this lesson or yesterday, whatever. Leprosy is not the disease that you're speaking about, and the Hashem speaking about in the Chumash. It's something else. What was it? Something else. It has to appear.
So I'm going to read Maimonides soon, who describes what it is. It's a skin discoloring. But the point is, when we say it's not leprosy, I mean it's not a physical ailment that's subject to physical laws of physical ailments. So if it would, then a lot of the laws here don't make sense. So this proves that we're not worried about just physical contamination or the disease spreading. So there's a spiritual idea here, and I'm going to read it after I give this interpretation from the Kabbalistic idea, finishing the previous idea. I'm going to read Maimonides, and he'll be able to put it in his own words, how really it's a mystical, a spiritual problem, a physical manifestation of a spiritual problem. And hopefully we'll have time to address the spiritual problem. And more importantly, hopefully we'll have time to address the purification of the spiritual problem, because even though the tzarat in its conventional sense does not apply today, but the message, of course, does.
Right, because when you're using the term skin, I think skin has another meaning. It's not dealing with human skin. I think he might be referring to I don't know what it is, but I think there's an allusion to something else.
Maybe in addition, but remember, we always have to stick to the simple meaning, to the basic meaning. In addition, we could add layers to it, but the basic meaning of the tzarat was actually on the skin of the human being, skin of his flesh. That's what the Torah says, or on garments or on homes. But yes, of course, we can always expand it, not just in addition to the literal meaning, to the figurative meaning as well. So that's okay.
Because skin is really a covering. So I'm thinking maybe it has to be metaphysical, the covering. There's a covering. I don't know how to go further with it.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to say about it. Just to give you one, like for example, one thing to say, the Kabbalists say, is that when a person has a spiritual problem, the question is that spiritual problem their core, or is it just on the surface level? So the skin represents the surface level. And the idea here is that when you see impurity within another person or within self, the most important thing to remember is that that's not the core of the other person. That yes, the person may have a spiritual ailment, but it's really on the surface level, meaning it's not their core. And their core is holiness and purity, and that allows for this impurity to be dealt with and to be perfected. Because if the impurity was their core, was in their essence, then perhaps you would not be able to purify yourself or to correct it. So the fact that we say, right, the opening statement of this of the story of the Tzarat, Adam, man, that will have kiyeh ba'or b'saro, that will be in the flesh of his skin, would be in the skin of his flesh, will be Tzarat, bring him to the Kohen, get a diagnosis, and then get purification. But what do we see from here? We see that all this is on the surface level. So when you see negativity within yourself, within somebody else, is it the core or is it the surface? The Torah is alluding to, it's on the surface. Again, that's just one way of it. Go ahead.
Okay, so basically, if a person says a bad thing, right? So now that's not the core of the person. He said it, but he really didn't mean it. But the emotional part, whatever took over that caused him to say something bad, is at the surface. It's not at the core.
Correct. At the core, we have purity. Correct. Agreed.
So, okay, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, it's not an interruption. Questions aren't interruptions. Go ahead, Karina, please.
Okay. No, I have a question. I don't know if you're going to talk about this later or not, but I was thinking about this idea of giving birth and the impurity, or that the womb, and also this idea of giving birth. I'm curious about this idea of giving birth to a male or a female. If is that like different levels of impurity? I would like to know a little bit more about that.
Let's talk about that.
Okay.
Because if I talk about what I talk about, who knows if anyone's interested? Maybe you're just sticking around to be polite. But if you raise the question, so now you're interested. Okay, good. That's what we learned from the Seder. We learned about the Seder that you have to get your kids to ask questions, because the problem with the parents are that we like to preach, but kids are not really listening, or people are not really listening. When someone asks a question, then you know, they have a question. Fine, they're interested. Okay, not that you're the kid, not that this is the Seder, but just the power of a question.
Okay.
So let's look at the verses. The verses seem very, very strange to the modern ear. I'm just going to lay out the problems. Number one, it sounds like if you give birth, you become impure. Why? What sin did you do? It's a what it should be the most joyous of times. Question number one. Question number two, if you look at male and female, this seems very chauvinistic. The female, the impurity is doubled. Okay, so let's read the verses just to get a feel. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives and gives birth to a male, she shall be unclean for 7 days. As in the days of her menstrual flow, she shall be unclean. Remember, unclean is a bad translation. English language doesn't have a word for tuma. Tuma is ritual impurity. Why do they write unclean? I don't know. Maybe because they want to save ink, but that was in the days when they wrote it on the book. This is a copy from a book. On the internet, maybe they're trying to save pixels. I don't know. Maybe it's because it's just too hard to write. Unclean, ritual impurity. But they write unclean. I'm going to say unclean, but it doesn't mean unclean, but whatever. Okay, so what do we have? A woman gives birth, 7 days unclean, fine, or impure, fine. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, circumcision, fine. What happens after that 3 days, after that 7 days and the 8th day? So now there's a period of 33 days. This 33 days is in between stage. In between stage means it's called blood of purity. It's days of purity, but it's in between. What do I mean it's in between? The woman still is not supposed to go to the temple. She's not allowed to go to the temple. She's not impure in the sense that she could theoretically, she can be with her husband, but she can't go to the temple. For a woman, you will see everything is double. The impurity is 2 weeks and instead of 1 week, and the days of purity instead of 33 is 66. So you get a total, with the male, it's a total of 40 days before she can go to the temple. The female, if you give birth to a female, it's a total of 80 days. So let's read verse 3, and on the verse 4. And for 33 days you shall remain in the blood of her of purity. It's called the blood of purity. She shall not touch anything holy, meaning to say not touch any flesh of the sacrifices, nor may she enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification have been completed. In other words, till the 40 days pass. But like I said, those 33 days, because of blood of purity, even if there's blood, it's considered pure blood, no problem. In other words, no problem in the sense of she's still pure, but still, it's not completely pure. She can't go to the temple. Fine. If she gives birth to a female, she shall be unclean for 2 weeks. In other words, impure for 2 weeks, like her menstruation period. In other words, complete impurity where she cannot be with her husband and certainly not go to the temple. And for 66 days, he shall remain in the blood of purity. In other words, in between stage, she's pure for her husband, she's not pure for the temple. When the days of purity conclude, then she comes to the temple and she brings offerings. What does she bring? She brings a sheep and a bird, or if she can't afford a sheep, 2 birds. That's the story in short. What do you do with this? Like, what does this mean? Like, what's the problem? What did I do wrong? All I did is give birth to a child. Giving birth to a child, the most spiritual thing a person could do. Bringing life into this world, the most godly thing a person could do. So this is a little bit unusual or unexpected, to say the least. And besides the fact, whatever you're going to say, you're going to have to explain what the business of doubling the impurity for a female. So if anybody wants to take a shot at it, go ahead. If anybody wants to try to explain. It's just strange, right? I think, am I right? If you think that if this makes sense to you, let me know.
Rabbi?
Yes.
On a side of this, doesn't it imply that you want to have a male rather than a female?
On the surface, yeah. Who wants a female? The impurity is doubled.
Right.
The reality is that that's one way it could be read, but I don't think that's the true meaning. But I think that's the reality of one way to read it, and I think that the reality is that historically people may have read it that way because in general people felt they wanted a male. They weren't necessarily as excited when they had a female. I don't know. I'm not a historian, but I could see that this verse gives this impression. I don't think that's what the verse is trying to do, but I could see where somebody would get that impression.
Yeah, thanks.
Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I just wanted to bring a thought about that particular scenario, and also to the contrast that you pointed out in the introduction between the extreme holiness and extreme unholiness. It's maybe not only the tension within the human soul or two souls, but also that the extreme holiness sometimes attracts in extreme unholiness. So, and that ties to that particular scenario where you're giving birth, so you're separated from a life that's just also extremely holy, because it's a new soul.
Right. So what Vicky is saying, Vicky says, don't be. Yeah. So Vicky's saying, don't be surprised that something as holy as giving life also has a side effect of impurity, because that's what we're saying. Somehow or another, however we explain it, we're saying that life now is comprised of, whenever there's intense holiness, there can also be unholiness, because that's really what life is. And therefore, Vicky is not, as the Kabbalist of the group, is not surprised to find that giving birth would bring about a little bit of some sense, a side effect of unholiness. Yeah, go ahead, Karina.
No, I was thinking, I don't know if it was in a class with Mariachi or something, that it was also related. Now I remember that in that moment of giving birth, that, as Vicky says, it's like a godly moment or very holy moment. And then I think this was the explanation, something like this. It's like when that ends, it's like you feel like very bad or very sad. That's like, for example, the postpartum depression or something like that. So that, because like you experience something so intense and holy and everything. And then when it's finished, it's like you go down, it's like you disconnect from that part. So maybe that was the explanation about also like the impurity, like the
no, I agree. I agree.
Like that.
That explanation is very old. It's from a Kuzari, so it's like 800 years old. So it's not New Age. Just to elaborate a little bit on what Karina is saying. Where does impurity come? Ironically, the one way to define impurity is wherever there was a vacuum of holiness. So where there's no holiness, there's no susceptibility to impurity. Something cannot be impure unless it's could be used for holiness, unless there's some potential for holiness. And something that had holiness, and then the holiness departed, that created a vacuum, that's where unholiness enters. And again, I'm going to try to, or impurity enters. I'm going to try to define what that means maybe later, but let's do one thing at a time. So for example, the Kabbalists say, when you wake up in the morning, you're supposed to wash your hands. The law says you have to wash your hands for prayer, just to have clean hands. But the Kabbalist, the Zohar says, and it's actually quoted in the Code of Law. It's one of the only things from this, one of the things in the Zohar that's quoted in the Code of Law, that says like this. What happens is, the Talmud says that sleep is a 60th of, okay, let's start from the beginning. What's the prototype? What's the best example of something that's impure? A corpse, a dead person. Why a dead person? Because here you had a body that had holiness, that had a soul. Now there's the vacuum, the soul is gone. The vacuum is a place where unholiness comes. And now, to my previous point, I go to sleep at night. The Talmud says that death, that sleep, is a 60th of death. Right? I'm not as awake and aware and I'm clothed within my body when I'm sleeping. So it's a 60th of death. So when I wake up, there's some unholiness, and that's why we wash hands in the morning. So that's how you define impurity. What that means in a minute, what that means we may elaborate later, but that's the definition of impurity. So Karina says that whenever there is a vacuum of holiness, that's where there's impurity. In the case of giving birth. So here, there's the moment of giving birth, okay, but even before that, you have 9 months of harboring a soul, a body, a soul within yourself, harboring life within yourself. And when that emerges, on one hand, it's a great joy, but on the other hand, for the woman, there's a vacuum of life. And that vacuum of life creates a certain vacuum, and that's spiritually the idea of impurity. And Karina also adds that there's also psychological ramifications, which could be depression. In other words, whenever, in some way to think about what's in some sense, the most dangerous time for a person is after you have a very good high, right? You're working for a goal for 9 months or for 10 months or for a year. You got your job, you got your dream job, you had your dream experience. You wanted to achieve something. You wanted to achieve a certain goal. You wanted to climb the Everest. You wanted to publish a poem. You wanted to make it to a play in a band, whatever you wanted to do. And you go and you achieve, and it gives you fuel. This goal gives you fuel. Comes to the moment you achieved your goal. Tomorrow morning, now what? That vacuum is not a healthy place. And therefore, the Torah says you're impure. Impure doesn't mean you're bad. Impure means you have to work to purify yourself. You have to work to make sure that you become pure, because that space is potentially spiritually and psychologically dangerous, right? You have people who come back from the army and they can't get back to civilian life. Why? Because there's so much adrenaline, there's so much meaning in doing what they were doing for years, and they come back to civilian life. It's just not as exciting in comparison to what they were going through. Now there's nothing going on. There's nothing that's exciting enough. What am I going to do? Just we'll go to work and pay my bills. That doesn't feel as exciting and meaningful as what I have been doing till now. So what we're saying is, in some sense, specifically when you have so there's two ways of saying. One way to speak in the language speaking in the language of the law, of a Torah law, of ritual, you say when there's a lack of life, when there's a vacuum of life, you're going to have impurity, which, by the way, explains also not just the giving birth, but it's also the menstrual period, because every month, what it is, it's the potential for life, potential to give birth, and when that passes, there's a certain vacuum, and that vacuum is the impurity. Okay, fine. Now so that's and then you have another way of speaking the same language is that when you have an intense moment, when you have an intense spiritual moment, the next morning is actually the most dangerous time, because now there's a vacuum. And when you have a vacuum, people tend it could attract negativity, because I need additional stimulation to live up to that experience that I had yesterday. And if I don't have it because that experience is past, now I'm going to find it maybe in the wrong places. Okay, now if you want to talk about the numbers, why it's doubled, so there's a few interpretations. The best interpretation, consistent with what we just said, you would say you can say that if the impurity comes because of a vacuum of holiness, then it would stand to reason that the more holiness, the more impurity. And in that sense, you would say that if for the female, there's more of an impure period, doubled, that would mean maybe there's more life in the female. So the vacuum is greater. Why is there more life in the female? So the simplest interpretation would be because the female herself is potential for life. In other words, the female itself represents the ability to harbor new life. So in that sense, it would be consistent that it's almost like within the female, you have two or more potentials for life, the female and the female's ability to harbor life herself, opposed to the male. Okay, so it's life, but it's not the potential to harbor life. So that is one way of looking at it. There are others, but that's one way of thinking about this. So thank you, Karina, for raising it and giving insight. Thank you. Go ahead, Vicky.
I had a question about this interpretation. How come only woman is the potential for life? men also participating in conceiving.
Yes, it's participating, but there's a difference between participating and participating and harboring, right? To allow to life to develop within her. She's harboring life. It's much more than just contributing. Like the joke, when we were kids, we said a joke. They said a joke. It's not a joke. It's a serious story. I don't know if it happened, but it's a true story. You know, not every true story happened. There's a story that happened, but it's not true. There's no real message. Then there's a story that's true, it just never happened. So this is a true story that never happened. So the story is like this. The story is that it's not exactly related, but it's related enough to excuse to put a joke because you're supposed to say a joke. So one day the pig and the chicken are walking down the street, and they pass a store, and the store advertises that breakfast menu is bacon and eggs. So the chicken is very proud. Look, they're serving bacon and eggs. We're so prominent. Everybody wants us. Everybody wants us. It's wonderful. So the chicken turns to the pig and says, "Look, this is unbelievable. Look what we achieved. We have this bacon and eggs here. It's unbelievable." So the pig turns to the chicken and says, "No. I forget the punchline, but this is the idea. It was said much better. He says, no. You are just giving your eggs. I am giving myself." Right? There's a big difference. Yeah, you're contributing. You're giving an egg. That's not, you can't compare that to what I'm giving. I'm giving myself. So you're not on the same level here. Okay. So we need you. Yeah, you can't have bacon and eggs without the eggs, right? So you need eggs, but take it easy. You know, you're not, in Yiddish, you say, you're not the hype mechutin. You're not the chief mechutin. Mechutin means making a wedding. You're marrying up your kids. It's your joy. You're not as, you know, it's nice, but we need your contribution, but take it easy. So that's, Richard, you like that one. Okay.
But also the restaurant that the chicken and the pig walked by, I'm sure it wasn't kosher.
It probably was not kosher. You're right.
Right.
But don't worry, the story never happened. I already told you it never happened, but it's still a true story.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move a little bit to the laws of, okay. I want to say one more word about purity and impurity, and it's going to come up again in the fourth book, at the end of the fourth book, but hopefully by then we'll be able to elaborate upon it. There's one beautiful interpretation of purity and impurity, and that is as follows. Purity represents when you say someone is spiritually impure, ritually impure, what you're saying is they are in a state that they are susceptible to consciousness that is dangerous. In other words, if they don't do something to try to purify themselves, they're in a dangerous consciousness. Doesn't mean they did anything bad. Doesn't mean they will do anything bad, but it's spiritually dangerous to be in that mind frame. Nothing wrong you did. Circumstances place you in a place that is spiritually dangerous or morally dangerous. And when the Torah says purify yourself, it's do certain actions that will remove you out of that negative consciousness. For example, let's take the prime example, a dead person. Going to a funeral, and more importantly, touching a dead person, coming in contact with a dead body, puts you in a spiritually negative space and a morally negative space. Now, I'm not a psychologist, and Beth is not here, so I can't say, you know, I'm not speaking so much psychologically, because even though I'm sure there's some of that, depression, etc., but also morally, in the language of the commentators, some of the commentators, specifically Shamshin and Fal Hirsch, he talks about this, writes about this at great length. What is Judaism's basic claim? Judaism's basic claim, which was revolutionary then, and now is also becoming more revolutionary because the world is falling back to the old model, is that a person does not have freedom. A person doesn't have moral freedom. A person is not able to control their instincts because basically we're a social animal, and just like animals are, we're just a sophisticated animal, and just like animals are controlled by their instincts, we are controlled by our instincts. There can be no claim, no moral claim that a person should try to improve themselves because we can't, because we're trapped by our nature. And then Torah comes out and says, no, that's ridiculous. Torah says, no, it's wrong. The Torah says we have moral free choice. We can't have choice to do anything we want. I can't play on the NFL tomorrow. I'm not strong enough, but I have a free moral choice, moral decisions. What I choose to do, I can control my instincts. And that's the Torah's big claim. What is the big threat to the Torah's claim? Death. What does death tell you? Death tells you you are just a biological creation, right? You're here today, gone tomorrow. You're weak. You're not strong. You're not free. You're trapped by nature. Don't drive yourself crazy. Don't convince yourself otherwise. When I come in contact with a dead person, I'm in a spiritually dangerous zone, because if I really take this message to heart, that I am just a biological creature that's limited and finite and mortal, then when it comes to my next moral test, I'm not going to understand that I have moral freedom. And therefore, I have to purify myself. And when you go to look at the laws of purity, you will see that all the laws of purity are here to highlight to the person himself, the soul. And yes, my body is mortal, but my soul is immortal. Yes, my body is trapped. My body is not free, but my soul is free. And that's a general view of laws of purity and impurity. And you can apply this to every area of purity and impurity. But the point here is the laws of purity is the ability to realize that my soul, even though my body is under the laws of nature and trapped by nature and has certain limitations, my soul doesn't have any limitations. And you could talk about this about all forms of impurity. Even just the birth, he talks about it in the context of birth as well, because when the person gives birth, even though they're so joyous and they want to be happy, there's so much pain. So what that potentially could highlight to the person that you can't free yourself from the pain, from the physicality. You're trapped by your body. And there's certain pain and depression that can come along and you can't do anything about it. Even though you want to be joyous, there's this pain you cannot escape. And really what's happening here is the Torah is telling you that this is a dangerous space, because if you follow this line of logic further down the line, you may get to a space where, say, just like my body is trapped, my soul is trapped. And purity is my soul is not trapped. How that plays out, every place it plays out different. That's just something about purity and impurity. I have only 7 minutes left, and I really want to talk about a few points about the Tzarat. I want to read Maimonides, and I also want to say something that I haven't said in the past. So that's interesting, because we've been doing this for many years now. I don't know, what are we doing this for? 14 years, maybe more. So something I never said in the past. That's exciting for me. Okay, so let's read Maimonides first. Maimonides is basically going to make the statement and say, when you read the Tzarat, make no mistake, this is not physical ailment, even though the Torah doesn't say what it's for. The sages say it was a punishment that God would send to people who would slander, would speak negative about other people. And Maimonides basically says, this is wondrous, this is supernatural. And therefore, don't expect it to happen today, because it only happens when in the era of miracles. So that's what Maimonides says. I want to read Maimonides, and it's a long piece. We could stop at any point because we just need the first paragraph, but we can go on. And then I want to say one point that I'm excited about because I never said before. Okay, so let's share the screen and we do Maimonides. Maimonides has no less than 16 chapters on the laws of Tzarat. Could you imagine? 16 chapters. This is like more than he has on buying and selling. But that's what it is. It takes up a big part of the written Torah and the oral Torah. At the conclusion of the 16th chapter, the conclusion of, I believe it's the conclusion, I'm not making a mistake, it's the conclusion. Yes, it's the conclusion of the laws of Tzarat. Finally, after 16 chapters of getting into every detail of what the different shades of Tzarat and what's pure and what's impure, thank God Maimonides now gives us some background and tells us what to do with this, what to make of this. Says Maimonides, Tzarat, by the way, he doesn't usually do this, and not in this book. Usually his reasoning for the mitzvot he puts into the Guide to the Perplexed. In any case, Tzarat is a collective term including many afflictions that do not resemble each other. For the whitening of a person's skin is called Tzarat, as is the falling out of some of the hair of his head or beard, and the change of color of clothes or houses. Okay, this is the beginning. I'm not going to read the whole thing all the way down to the bottom because we're going to run out of time. But I just want to read a few lines. This change that affects clothes and houses, which the Torah described with the general term of Tzarat, is not a natural occurrence. So it's not leprosy. It's not a skin disease. Instead, it is a sign and wonder prevalent among the Jewish people to warn them against Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara literally is evil speech, undesirable speech. When a person speaks Lashon Hara, the walls of his house change colors. If he repents, the house will be purified. If, however, he persists in his wickedness until the house is destroyed, the leather implements in his house upon which he sits and lies change colors. If he repents, they will be purified. If persists in his wickedness until they are burnt, the clothes he wears change colors. If he repents, they will be purified. If he persists in his wickedness until they are burnt, his skin undergoes changes and develops sarat. This causes him to be isolated and to be made known that he must remain alone so that he will not be involved in the talk of wicked, which is folly and lashon hara. Enough said here. I want to just talk about this. So Maimonides follows the sages which say that the sarat would come for lashon hara, for slander. Maimonides continues, it says a biblical source for this, because we see later in the Torah that Miriam is afflicted with sarat when she speaks against Moses, etc. There are other biblical proofs, but that's the tradition as well. Okay, fine. What happens to the person who speaks? So let's talk about slander for a moment, or evil talk, or talking negative about others. So ultimately, the sarat is going to put you in a place that, in some sense, we mentioned this yesterday, in some sense, that sarat leprosy, that sarat impurity is more severe than all other forms of impurity. Because all other forms of impurity, even ones that are severe, a person would have to leave the camp, meaning leave the holy city, let's say leave Jerusalem. But you can hang out with other impure people. But that mitzorah, that sarat, the person afflicted with sarat, cannot be quarantined with other people who have the same affliction. You say, why not? Right? COVID. If you have COVID and you can hang out with other people who have COVID, it's wonderful. But here, no. The sarat, you have to be alone. That's what the Torah says clearly. Badad Yeshev, he should sit alone outside the camp, meaning even outside the camp, he has to be alone. He can't be with other impure people. So what's the meaning? So the convention, so the standard interpretation, which we say every year, is that what's the problem with slander? What's the problem with negative talk? The problem is that negative talk really cuts upon and tears apart the fabric of society. Society is built on trust, on the ability to know that I respect you, you respect me, I care for you, you care for me. The moment I start suspecting maybe you're talking behind my back, there's no trust, there's no society. And the person who's actively speaking and spreading rumors and spreading things about other people, he's literally tearing the fabric of society. He should be outside the camp. Why? Not a punishment, but let him sit alone. Let him realize, you sit alone. For the first day, it's cute and fun. After a while, it's depressing and devastating. Today, you could sit alone and watch Netflix. But if there's no Netflix, what are you going to do alone? Right? Today, we have all kinds of ways to entertain us, so we shouldn't be afraid of sitting alone. But in the olden days, you can't. Alone means alone. Alone is alone, and it's very difficult, and it's very difficult place for a human being to be. And why then? Now he realizes the value of community, the value of other people, and he'll appreciate it, and then he'll understand that what he was doing was wrong, because the guy I'm speaking against, I actually need him, because if he doesn't come to synagogue and I don't tell him good morning and I don't rub shoulders with him, I'm alone, I'm depressed. So that's the process really of rehabilitation. That's the conventional interpretation that we say every year. Now I'm going to say something a little bit different, which is both true, it's not a contradiction. Okay, why does somebody speak slander? Why do I speak about somebody else? So there could be different reasons, but probably the most prevalent reason, essentially, if you get down deep, and again, we don't have the psychologist on the call, so I'll be the amateur psychologist, and I'll say that a person speaks slander because of ultimately what's beneath everything is jealousy. Here you have somebody who's successful. And if that person's successful, now I feel bad that I'm not on that level. So if I could somehow bring them down, then I am raised and I'm elevated without having to do any effort. Isn't that nice? Instead of me having to elevate myself, pull the other guy down, I feel good about myself. Why am I so happy when this person, if I could convince somebody that this guy is bad, because this guy is a threat to my ego, because in some sense he has something that I don't have and I'm jealous. And the jealousy creates the idea of slander, which then brings around the tzarat. And nobody is totally free of jealousy. It's very hard to be totally free of jealousy. We look at other people, we're ambitious, we want more for ourselves. We say, hey, how come that guy has more than me? How come he's more successful than me? And it makes people uncomfortable. Ultimately, there's people that get under our skin because they have something we don't have. So we put the person out of the camp. That's the punishment. But it's not punishment, it's rehabilitation. What happens when you're outside the camp alone? So first of all, when you're in a group, even a group of other impure people, there's community, we're together. I could just sort of ride along. I don't have to make my own breakfast. Maybe there's a collective breakfast. If you're alone, you have to do everything by yourself. You have to make sure you have heat. You have to make sure you're eating breakfast 3 meals a day. You're not part of the bigger group. You're forced to focus on yourself, forced to find the strength within yourself to survive. And you're forced to focus inward. Now, this I forgot the main point. What causes jealousy? Ultimately, it's not that I'm jealous of the other person. Ultimately, it's I'm not happy with myself. Had I been happy with myself, then the other person's success doesn't bother me. Right? So ultimately, if I'm speaking slander, it's caused by jealousy, which is caused what? What is that jealousy? I don't care that you have more than me. I'm not happy with myself. And therefore, I'm not happy. I'm jealous of you. But if I can celebrate what I have, and if I can appreciate my life, my blessings, my gifts, and my own personality, then the other person's success doesn't bother me. So in some sense, putting the person alone is not to punish, of course not. It's to rehabilitate, not just to realize the value of community, but more importantly, to realize the value of self. And if you realize the value of self, then the other person doesn't make me uncomfortable. The other person, I'm not jealous of the other person, and therefore I can be part of a community with the other person, even if he's more successful than me in certain ways, because I appreciate what I have. I appreciate my gifts, my life, my blessing, and I'm focused inward. And the way you force the person to focus inward is, first of all, rely on yourself. You're alone, and you have no choice. You can't sit and say, well, that guy cooks a better lunch than me. No, you have no choice. You make your own lunch. Oh, so you figure out how to make lunch. Oh, you celebrate, you work, you invested, you appreciate it, you enjoy. You're not here. You can't sit and watch and focus on other people. There's no one else to focus on. There's no one else to watch. So going out of the camp forces you to look inward. You look inward, you embrace yourself. You're not going to be jealous of others. You're not going to be jealous of others. You will not slander. And you would appreciate the community for the positive aspects, and not that I'm part of a community is like every person in the community is making me uncomfortable, because every person reminds me that I'm not that they have more than me, but every person in the community reminds me that I'm not happy with self. So ultimately, I have to go back and embrace the self and appreciate yourself, and then community would only enhance the self. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. Thank you for joining. Come back next week for the purity of the Tzarat, and that's it. And if whatever we didn't finish this year, come back next year, same time, same place, God willing, in good health.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful day, everybody. Go ahead,
Thank
Vic.
I had a question for you. First of all, I want to thank you for that explanation. That was very deep and very useful, especially in time of isolation, like physical isolation of everybody, when everybody is forced to kind of look inside.
Right.
But my question is about the old days. There was no Zoom, obviously, but will Cohen be allowed to visit?
So not really. You see in the thing, the Kohen goes out the camp, and then he meets, but they can't get too close. And the Kohen is there to inspect, because in the part of the process is the Kohen has to see if it's getting better or getting worse, or he's purified. So there's some interaction, but you cannot describe it as togetherness.
But did they have like some kind of spiritual guide, like in form of Torah or something like that? Because when you go look inside, you're trying to figure out yourself. You have to look for like
You need a map. You need a map, right? You need a map, because inside sometimes is a jungle.
Yeah. Torah or spiritual guidance from somebody. So I was just wondering. Of course, there was no Zoom, but that will help. That would help.
Yeah. So I think that the first thing is the person has to, even on a psychological level, so the answer is the Kohen wasn't there every day, but occasionally the Kohen would be there, right? So one way to think about it is the first thing is focus on self. There's no one else to look at. Today we can sit at home and open up Facebook and just see everybody else, because nobody posts their problems on Facebook, right? You ever saw anyone get up and say, my life is terrible on Facebook? Only if they want more likes, they want more attention. But ultimately, people highlight only the good things, right? So you could sit outside and see, and basically see everybody else's blessings. And if you feel inadequate with yourself, it's just going to highlight it. But if you got rid of everything, so just sitting alone, if this is your problem to focus inward, just sitting alone already is the building blocks of the rehabilitation, because you're forced to focus inward and you're forced to produce. And then the Kohen comes out and gives you spiritual guidance and gives you and tells you how to deal with this. But yeah, the Kohen is not there every day. No, part of the problem is I need to be alone. Again, part of the problem is taking responsibility. And if I rely on the Kohen too much, I'm outsourcing to him and I'm jealous of him, right? No, Kohen can give you the general sign points, but you're on your own. You can fix yourself. Nobody else could.
Thank you. But that sometimes it's enough, just a little bit, like
Yeah,
a little direction.
Correct,
Thank you. Thank you
correct.
very much. That
Yeah.
we are receiving here. Thank you.
Or everyone's receiving from another. That's the beauty of community. I guarantee you that if anybody wouldn't be here, it would not come out the same way, right?
So Rabbi,
All the ingredients mixed together.
Thank you.
so Rabbi,
Yes.
what would happen if a Kohen got one of these blemishes?
Also, Cohen's susceptible to tzarat. He also goes outside. The Cohen is also jealous. The Cohen has its own problems. Maybe he has a spiritual position, but every other Jew gets a portion in the land of Israel, gets an income, gets a steady income, gets a field. The Cohen has no land in Israel, which means it's an agricultural society. He has no own personal wealth or personal security. If he wants to sustain himself and his family, he has to be provided for by the community, by the tithings, which is not a great place to be. So the Kohen is also susceptible to jealousy of others, right? Inadequacy, not sufficiently being appreciating your own position and your own gifts. So the Kohen could receive tzara just like everybody else. Then you would need another Kohen to look. We read it yesterday in Maimonides. Maimonides says a person could inspect any blemish except their own. You can't inspect your own blemish because you're biased. But yes, that would another Kohen would have to take a peek.
So no professional courtesy.
No.
All right. Thanks, Rabbi.
Okay. Wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank